This is a video about philosophy and political philosophy, but it's not an overview, it's not a summary, it's not a book review of the work of a particular philosopher. I'm going to talk about how this philosophy has impacted my life and continues to impact my life, which in a lot of ways it's worth talking about in general, and it seems to me especially well suited to YouTube as a format. It's really easy to meet people, whether it's in a university context or even, like on the job, coworkers, who will say in a vague way, in a universal, generalizing, abstract way, that the philosophy of Aristotle is tremendously important to them. Or maybe even it's a modern philosopher like Habermas or something. But then if you ask them, you try to do it in a polite and non-confrontational way, how does the philosophy of Aristotle actually influence or impact or change their lives? They may have nothing to say. They may have nothing positive to say. Once in a while you talk to somebody about Aristotle and they can just vaguely say that it's part of European culture or that it influences them in terms of their appreciation of the theater or something like that. But they're not able to break down for you in terms of political activism, in terms of particular aspirations, how Aristotle actually shapes or informs what they do, what they say, how they feel, how they live their lives, right? No shade, but, and again, I've spent a large part of my life inside universities and on university campuses and talking to people with PhDs and people getting PhDs. But I think the comment I just made is true of people at all levels of education, because I've also met people who dropped out of high school, but who independently took the time to read and really cared about certain authors in the philosophy section of the library, but they still couldn't really speak in those terms or answer those questions. So, the philosophy of Max Stirner, the main thing I'm known for here on YouTube is talking about politics of the vegan movement, politics of ecology, politics of animal rights. And one subtle but obvious way in which Max Stirner influences how I engage with those issues is that I simply address animal rights as a set of arbitrary human-created values. So implicitly and explicitly, there are many people within veganism and ecology who would talk about animal rights in terms of the animals having a soul or in terms of nature having an inherent value. And if you've read Max Stirner, or maybe you've come to this video after looking at the Wikipedia article on Max Stirner, you know that he would be very, very critical of that sort of approach. So in philosophical parlance, he would be against the hypostatization of values, right? Instead, talking about values as something human beings create. To use my own imagery, this isn't quoting Max Stirner, something we draw like lines on a map, right? Why does the border exist between Canada and the United States? Why does the border exist, where it exists, between Spain and Portugal? This doesn't exist in nature. It isn't something inherent to the mountains or the rivers or the forest or the land. These are human-created values that we project onto the map. And that doesn't mean they're meaningless, but they are in a sense arbitrary, and they may have been arbitrated by centuries of war or negotiations or disputes, but we regard these as completely human-created values. So in the same way that human beings sit down and draw lines on a map, sit down and negotiate a treaty, sit down and create a convention in that sense, I don't regard animal rights as something originating in the animal. It's something we as human beings are going to sit down and discuss and ascribe to animals. And that is very Stirnerian. That's showing Max Stirner's influence. I read Max Stirner before I got seriously interested in Buddhist philosophy, as a matter of fact. This is way, way back. This is like year 2000, around there, 1999, 2000, something like that. And I remember one of my professors who was a lifelong expert in Buddhist philosophy. I was telling him about philosophy of Max Stirner that he didn't really know. He'd heard of Stirner. Stirner became a little bit famous because he was criticized by Karl Marx. So his place in history was guaranteed, actually, because he was criticized by Marx at such length. Marx wrote a huge number of pages about philosophy of Max Stirner. It's really bad writing. It's not worth reading, Marx's critique, but that guaranteed him a kind of place in the history books. Anyway, I remember I went through Stirner's main book, The Ego on Its Own, and I picked out all of the passages dealing with the philosophy of selfishness and selflessness, philosophical concept of the self and self-interest. And I put them together in one document for my professor. This professor, again, was a lifelong specialist in Buddhist philosophy. And his first reaction after he read it was, it's very Buddhist-y. That was actually how he said it to me face to face. There's definitely a kind of easy bridge between philosophy of Max Stirner and the hard core philosophy of Buddhism, which is also very interested in questions of self and non-self. And, I would say also Buddhism is integrally concerned with the role of desire in cognition, which you can gloss as wishful thinking. But if you really think about what do we mean when we talk about wishful thinking, how wanting shapes knowing, how desire shapes what we perceive and fail to perceive, these are things that I think both Buddhist philosophy and Max Stirner's philosophy and so on have some kind of connection to. Anyway, I got some hate mail, to be blunt, lately from someone who watches the channel to some extent, someone who was angry at me. And when this guy was angry at me, I could read out exactly my reply, but I think there's no point. He reproached me by saying that various ostensibly good things I do on the internet, including ostensibly good and positive things I've done towards him, reaching out to him and say just being supportive and positive toward him. He reproached me by suggesting that I only did these things out of self-interest, right? And this brings us back to philosophy of Max Stirner. Many, many people would respond to that as an insult, which it was meant to be. I mean, he was really insulting me and insulting my work and what I've done with my career. I don't mean on YouTube, but in real life. I'm talking about self-interest this way. And I wrote back saying, you're right. These are self-interested things. All of this is self-interested, but it tells you something about who I am myself. I do think you can look at my reasons for why I went to Laos and did humanitarian work. Laos is a poor country in Southeast Asia where I did some humanitarian work. I did a lot of research. I own that. There's an element of self-interest. The most explicitly humanitarian work I did was with an agency that literally handed out sacks of rice to starving people. A lot of the other work was less directly humanitarian, where you're doing research on the effectiveness of an AIDS intervention, government attempts to prevent the spread of AIDS, doing AIDS education. Some of that is not nearly as face-to-face, directly humanitarian as giving food to starving people, but it is still humanitarian work in a meaningful sense. But I went through these examples, whether it's my concern about the extinction of the Ojibwe language. Ojibwe is a language indigenous to Canada, also called Anishinaabe, or Cree, also called Nihiwewen. Whether it's the language research or the humanitarian work or what I'm doing now in terms of engaging with the politics of veganism, I didn't say back to him, no, how dare you say this is self-interested? How dare you say that what I'm doing on YouTube, is selfish rather than selfless? You're right. I am doing these things out of my self-interest, but you need to understand who I am, what kind of a guy I am, why this is in my interest, And of course, we mean that more than just in the sense of why I take an interest, but that is nevertheless part of it. My grandmother lived her whole life in Canada and never took any interest in our native people, in the Cree, the Ojibwe. My parents lived through the Vietnam War and protested against the Vietnam War and never really took any interest in Laos or Cambodia, even though they actually got out in the streets holding a flag and protesting. Why did they not take an interest in these things? Why was it not in their self-interest and it was in mine? Ultimately, because of who I am, because of the type of guy I am. And acknowledging the role of self-interest, not holding up this kind of phony Christian cultural tradition of pretending that you're doing things in a self-sacrificing way, but openly and honestly saying, yes, there is an element of my ego involved here. There's an element of my self-expression. That's really the crucial term with Stirner, to understand that in the same way that a painter or an artist, starts a project because of who they are in a meaningful sense. I also took on these projects, whether it was language research or humanitarian work or explicitly political work, political activism, because of who I am, because I've got it in me to do so, because of my interest and my self-interest, and dealing with that honestly and openly. That's a real example of the legacy of Max Stirner's philosophy in my own life. So look, guys, in this video, I didn't want to provide any kind of overview of the philosophy of Max Stirner. This isn't like a survey video. This isn't an introduction to philosophy of Max Stirner. This is just talking about how it has impacted my life. And I think, even though I've been vague about it, I think it should be kind of obvious to you that, Stirner in many ways actually led me to be more interested in Buddhist philosophy. And then also it led me to have this more honest and open view of, the individual as political activist or political lobbyist, where we don't pretend that the role of political advocacy is self-sacrificing, is self-abnegating. I also don't deal with these things in terms of like white guilt. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, I feel so terrible about being born white in Canada, therefore I'm interested in Native people and poor people and oppressed, but therefore I'm interested in people who are in prison and prison education. Those are also interests I have, where you just talk honestly and openly about who you are, about why you care, about what your values are, maybe what your creative role is in this political theater you're talking about, and maybe what your destructive role is in this particular, political theater you're talking about. So yeah, I mean, Stirner's own politics in his time, he was really attacking, to use one example, overly idealistic views of what the organization of labor would entail. It's a very instructive example to understand rapidly why Stirner's perspective is what it is. He did not think that organizing a labor union was going to save the world or make the world a better place in these miscellaneous, very idealistic ways. That was very popular. I mean, he was alive at the same time as Karl Marx, as has been mentioned. Instead, actually, Stirner compares what organizing labor unions will do. He compares it to organized crime, which at the time was quite insightful. If you think about the decades immediately after Max Stirner's death, during his life after Stirner's death, he describes what organizing a labor union is going to really accomplish in the world as being similar to organizing, like the mafia. He says this is self-interested, it's about money, it's about, you got a bunch of window washers who want to make more money, who want to have better working conditions also, maybe they want better safety on the job, what have you. And they're going to get organized, and they're going to refuse to work unless people pay them enough. And there's going to be inevitable violence between these window washers and the other window washers who refuse to work for the union and charge a lower price, are willing to work for a lower price. It's this totally down-to-earth, non-idealistic, non-idealizing view, pragmatic view of what organizing labor really entails, what trying to get better wages and working conditions entails. And that is like a glass of cold water compared to all the bullshit that emerged both in the left wing and the right wing during Stirner's own time. That's really a glass of cold water compared to everything that went on in anarchism. And I've seen academic essays really seriously arguing that in a sense Max Stirner invented anarchism. There already was a kind of Christian anarchism at that time. And hilariously, Stirner attacks the anarchists, the people who published. He says the anarchists, everything that's wrong with the Christians is wrong with the anarchists, but the anarchists are even worse. They're even more pious. They're even more true believers than the Christians. And at the time he was writing, that was really true. I mean, the anarchists who had published prior to and during Stirner's lifetime. He really touched off a new direction in anarchism, I would say, this very down-to-earth mentality. But, one of the misconceptions about Stirner is that his discussions of selfishness and the self leads to, well, put it this way, a lack of humanitarian motives, a lack of humanitarian impulse. And that's not the point at all. Stirner says very clearly in his text, and I actually pointed this out to David Leopold, the editor of the main version of Stirner that's available in English. And by the way, the English translation is terrible. You have to read the original German. Maybe the Spanish is okay, maybe the French is okay. But specifically, the English translation of Stirner is very, very poor. But I remember writing this to David Leopold, Stirner says of himself very clearly, at several points in the text, but there's one in particular, where he says, he says of himself, he loves all mankind. He says his point is not that he doesn't love particular men or that he doesn't care about his humanitarian goals. He can even love all mankind. He can feel love for all mankind. He can want to improve the world. But his point is that he relates to mankind as real individuals, one at a time, face by face, that it's meaningless and really dangerous to think of mankind as a hallowed abstraction, to think of it in nationalistic terms or universalistic terms, or what have you. You have to deal with people one at a time, face to face. Otherwise, you're really on a very dangerous road to madness. And it's a very important warning. I mean, depending on what age you are when you read Stirner, you might read it as a teenager, you might read it as an old man. There's a lot of truth there, and in some ways it takes life experience to see why that's important. Another little aphorism from Stirner on this issue of really dealing with the human reality of people individually, and the human reality of people even as a political movement in aggregate or what have you. He reproaches other philosophers by saying the approach of these other philosophers is to pretend that if only all of mankind wore one hat, nobody would have to take off their hat to one another. Now obviously it's wittier in the original German. The way he phrases this, it's a little bit more amusing, not in English translation. But that actually, even though it's just a funny turn of phrase, that really does cut deep, because it's saying the approach of these other philosophies, especially of course nationalistic philosophies, but also left-wing socialist and communist philosophies, in trying to treat humanity as one great towering abstraction. You're trying to argue that somehow you're elevating human beings by not dealing with the brutal, grotty reality of who they are and what they are. Now, I could talk about this actually in terms of veganism or in terms of Buddhism. Are we going to talk about the reality of who vegans are when I deal with them face to face, or even meat eaters? Because then from the vegan perspective, are we going to either glorify or demonize this abstract group of people, or are we going to talk in a pragmatic manner, face to face, one hat on each head, about the reality for these people? The same thing with the example of labor unions. Who are these individual workers? What is it they want individually? Probably, again, higher wages, better work conditions, maybe shorter working hours. They're not trying to save the world. Therefore, the function of their labor union, you have to really evaluate it in this way. What is it going to be? What's going to happen in the future? Who are vegans? What are their objectives? And, of course, we can generalize to some extent. Some vegans are obsessed with whales. Save the whales, save the dolphins. Some vegans don't care about that at all. Some vegans are obsessed with saving stray cats. They have an approach to the movement that's totally based on that. As some vegans are really based on like air pollution, concerns about global warming. A totally different approach and paradigm and set of objectives and concerns. Some vegans are just obsessed with food or weight loss or health, how you can be skinny. And really, again, sort of one hat on each head, not pretending that there's one hallowed abstraction that encompasses these people, that glorifies them and elevates them. And on the other hand, not looking at your opponents, not looking at meat eaters or even hunters. Vegans have a lot of common ground with some people who are hunters. If you care about conservation and ecology, you may find you have more in common with somebody who actually hunts animals and who eats the meat of the animals than you do with some of your fellow vegans. That's that pragmatic, face-to-face reality of dealing with particular men, not dealing with mankind as an abstraction. So those are the kinds of reflections that Max Stirner, the philosophy of Max Stirner really schools you in. And that's the sense in which it continues to have a kind of subtle influence on my life as I deal with vegan politics, and even in that private email correspondence, in some of those direct conversations with other vegans in my life. So that's it, guys. I do think if you have your own YouTube channel or you have your own platform on social media, I would encourage you to make videos of this kind. Yes, it is worthwhile to offer a Wikipedia-like discussion of what is this philosophy about. I mean, I know, of course, that exists, to do an introduction to a philosophy, a survey, if your point of your video is to help people with their homework. But I think it's more valuable, given the nature of this medium, given the advantages and disadvantages of what YouTube is, what social media is. I think it is probably more value to talk about what does this philosophy mean to me and in my life? Why did it matter? Because that's something you're not going to get off Wikipedia. That's something you're not going to get off of the back cover of the book. And I am out.